Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. Why so serious? Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Hello and welcome to this podcast review for August 18th. I'm Shadan Larkey.
And I'm Erica Richards.
We are your Chasing the Gold co-hosts, but we've come here today to talk about It Ends With Us. Directed by Justin Baldoni, written by Christy Hall, of course adapted from the best-selling book by Colleen Hoover. The movie stars Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni as our central couple. Erica, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, the number of times over the past 10 days since I've seen this movie that I have had the urge to text you, and the self-control that I have exhibited here is very impressive to me. As I mentioned, we normally do Chasing the Gold, but I know you felt strongly and I felt strongly that this is a movie that we should talk about and give some space and time to. So I'm really happy to be here with you. Let's dive into it because there's a lot going on in the world outside of the movie and the movie itself.
Yeah, there's a lot to discuss with this one. I appreciate your patience with me. I was on vacation in the rain in North Carolina when this movie came out, and my book club group, appreciate them too because they waited for me to get back from vacation to go to the movies, which is why we went today. I guess it was like about a week after the movie actually came out. So this is one I had been waiting for a long time. I read the book a while ago, probably over 2 years ago, and was excited for it to become a film. If for nothing else other than like the book was such a surprise for me because I had heard so much about it, right? Like on book Instagram, like I'm a reader. You and I have talked about this. People, if they listen, they know that we are readers. And this is one that like I had heard so much about it. I picked up and because I had read her other book, Verity, that is more of like a suspense thriller type of book, which is different from what she normally does. And I really enjoyed that one. So then I had heard so much about It Ends With Us. So I picked that one up too. And again, flew through it. I think I read it in 2 days. I think we talked about this before. I think I read it in like 2 days. So if nothing else, I was excited to see what they were going to do with it as a film. Now, I think everyone knows if you've been paying attention at all that this is a very, we'll say controversial. I think a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about just the subject matter of the film, of the narrative, and we can dive into that. I haven't been following all of the off-screen drama as closely, but I know that it's happening. And it's definitely been a whole thing with the film being in theaters. So, and I just left the theater. Like I literally just saw it. So
yeah,
I'm like,
Eric, this is like, very fresh for you. Yeah. Literally back home from your trip to the movies. So we should mention, I guess, just a little bit of context about what the controversy or drama that has happened is, which is that basically it's kind of a he said, she said situation where some people are alleging that Justin Baldoni was maybe a bit abusive or aggressive on set, and there was tension between him and the cast. He has not promoted the film with the rest of the cast. His interviews have all been solo. And then sort of Justin's camp is saying that Blake, overstepped, that she had a separate editor come in and sort of her and Ryan Reynolds was writing sections of the movie, that maybe they were sort of using their A-list power to sort of create a different version of the film. And then there's a lot of controversy about the way that the film has been marketed because Justin in his interviews is focusing very heavily on the domestic violence that takes place within the film and in the story. And Blake is sort of, maybe her marketing or interviews have been a little bit more about the romance that happens, and maybe she's focusing a little bit more on the lighter aspects of the film. And so there's this disconnect between the stars of the film and the way that this film has been marketed and maybe the messaging. Again, there's a lot of opinions. I don't know, Erica, do you feel strongly about?
I don't know how I feel, right? Because I also don't feel like I know all of the details, and I don't know if this like, is this just media spinning things up? Like, I also, like I said, have not been paying that close attention to like this drama, because it was like, no matter what, I'm gonna go see it. Like, I knew I was gonna go see it, right? So, like I said, I have heard about some of the drama. My question is, sorry, I was just thinking when you were talking about Blake bringing in another editor, was she one of the producers, like an executive producer on the film?
I need to check the exact. I think she does have. I know Justin's production company was like the big, so he does have an executive producer credit. I don't know if she does or not. Let me check on that.
Yeah, because I'm also like, okay, so he was the director. Like, how much say did she have in the editing process? I don't know. Again, this is where like I don't know if we know all the details enough for me to make a strong opinion one way or another. I know everyone knows that I'm skewed because I'm, obviously a fan of Blake Lively for many reasons, but her and Taylor Swift are besties. So of course I feel like she's one of my besties. And I really like her. Like, I like things that I've seen her in. I watched Gossip Girl when I was in college and I enjoyed that. I really loved A Simple Favor. I was a big fan of that one. And I just like have been a fan of Blake. Not like, I'm not saying like I'm a huge Blake Lively fan, but I like her. I've enjoyed pretty much everything I've ever seen her in. So I don't know. And like, I think it's kind of telling maybe a little bit that it seems like the cast is kind of, banded together and he's kind of an outlier. Do you think that has something to do with it? Like, I think, I don't know.
Yeah, I am having very complicated feelings about this situation because I don't know how much of it is PR spin. And so, yeah, right. I'm hesitant to sort of pick any sort of side because I feel like there's potentially so much more that could come out that we don't know about. But I will say my perspective is that this is one of those situations where I feel like both parties are in the wrong. Like, it's possible that maybe Justin did things to make people uncomfortable, but I also think this is a situation where Blake maybe used sort of the power that she carries as an A-list person, star, the sort of power couple, to maybe exert a certain level of control over the film. Maybe too much control, I guess, depending on who I mean, she is a PGA credited producer, but so, okay. And I do think I should say right up front that I do think the way that this movie has been marketed does make me very uncomfortable. Even like the screening that I went to, which like press was invited to, but it was also open to the public, was leaning very heavily into like the flowers. And, even my friend that I went with, she was like, this reminds me of when we went to see Barbie. And even like my local dine-in theater had like a Lily Bloom cocktail and the whole tagline was like, sip into the romance. And for a film about domestic abuse, I think I don't agree with that. I don't think that that's appropriate. Yeah. I think maybe it's like sending a wrong message to younger girls. I feel like, as older millennials, maybe we would be able to discern that. But if you're 15, 16 going to see this movie with your friends, are you getting the right kind of message? Are you coming away with from this film with the right ideas? Maybe not. I don't know. Yeah. But
what was this rated? Was it rated R?
It's PG-13.
Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, and okay. I have this as a reader of the book, I think the book too is sort of, if you don't read the book, you don't know what it's about. I mean, even the cover is like pink and floral, right? I mean, so I don't know. I think that is one of the things that is from the beginning rubbed me the wrong way. And so the fact that the film is maybe also leaning into that. And then the Taylor Swift of it all too is interesting because like her song is in the trailer and in the movie. Yeah. So like, I feel like it's kind of signaling to the Swifties like, hey, come see this film, which I'm not saying is wrong. I'm fascinated by all of it, Eric. I think the whole thing is really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's this weird thing where I see both sides, right? How do I say this? So when I say I see both sides, I also think it would be kind of detrimental to the marketing of the film if they came out and they were like, this is a movie about domestic abuse. Like, people don't necessarily want to go and like seek that out, right? I mean, so how do you carefully market this? I think if you ask me, if you watch the trailer, it is clear in the trailer that this movie has domestic violence. Is that enough? Is that not enough? I'm not really sure. Because it's a very delicate thing, right? It's a very delicate topic, A. B, again, how do you market that? That's not a marketable thing, right? Like, that is not something that people want to see, hear, talk about. I think they put it in the trailer in a way that was very clear what this movie dives into. I think if they would have left it out completely, that would have been the wrong choice.
Right.
I think they made the right choice by including it. I just don't know what I think, because it's also such a touchy subject, it's such a serious subject and such a heavy, important subject. I think that's why people feel so polarized about it, which I understand. But how else do people want them to, like, that's not a marketable thing for your film, right?
I completely agree with you. And we should mention, the movie did very well, a $50 million opening weekend, which is massive. So clearly there was an audience and an appetite. I think for me, what rubbed me the wrong, and there's literally a clip of Blake being like, grab your girlfriends, grab your florals. Like, I think.
Yeah, that's probably not.
I don't know. And I should mention, we had a guest contributor, Megan Kearns, who wrote a really beautiful article about what it was like as a domestic abuse survivor to see the film. So I think her perspective is really beautifully articulated in her piece. And I highly encourage everyone to go to In Session Film and read her work. And we'll make sure that it's linked below. But Erica, let's, I guess, get into the actual film. And maybe this is where we can talk about, because I'll just be upfront. I have to be honest with you that I went in to my screening ready to dislike this movie. Like, that was my mentality. I was ready to find reasons not to like it and to tell people that it doesn't treat the subject matter with the sensitivity that it deserves. But I have to be honest with you. I think I liked it. Obviously it's not an enjoyable film to watch, but I think it does handle I was impressed by the way that it handles certain things. And I felt like, and this is something that Megan touches on, when you're in a situation where the abuse is happening, it doesn't happen right away, right? It doesn't start the first day that you meet this person. And I think the film does a really beautiful job, and Justin does a really beautiful job in his performance of like the charming guy who kind of sweeps you off your feet, and then things start to spiral. And I think a lot of, if it's true to a lot of people's experiences, and I think that depiction of it was well done. And what did you feel about it?
Yeah, really quick, I do want to just echo your thoughts about Megan's piece. I read it as well, and I think everyone should go definitely give it a read. I also just want to say, like, up front, I am, again, very lucky and very privileged to have never dealt with any type of domestic violence or domestic abuse. I personally have never dealt with it. I had a friend who had dealt with it, and I might like talk about that a little bit later when we get into the film. But I think it very delicately dealt with it too. Again, I think this film is told from the woman's perspective. I think that's really important part of the storytelling here. And I will say that, like, I had seen a clip or read an article or something with Colleen Hoover talking about this book way before it was going to be made into a film. And she said that so this is also a very personal story to her, right? That she is a child of parents of domestic abuse. And so this is like kind of her story, her coping, her cathartic way of dealing with it as, you know, a child watching her parents. So again, I think people, that's also like kind of one of my little bit of an issue, is that people are talking about this like she just like made up, like, you know, it's like she is also sharing her experience, and I think that's part of it, right? And that's part of art and filmmaking and storytelling, and I just think that's been completely dismissed in this whole drama. But anyways, this was something that, like I said, I'd heard or read something, I don't know, that Colleen Hoover said, this is one of those books that I want people to read and then take it to their girlfriends and say, you have to read this, or you should read this book, or you know, you need to read this. And I did that, right? Like, I read it and then said to my best friend, like, you got to read this, you should read this, right? And then I even have a friend who recently, she hasn't read it, but I saw it sitting on her desk at work. And you know, I did say to her before, I was like, oh, you haven't read this yet, are you going to read it? And she was like, yeah. And I said, like, look up the trigger warnings just so you know what you're getting yourself into, right? Like, so I think we need to spin it, and this is like a good thing, like, that it's like, you know, it's discussing these things that people don't really talk about, right? I went in to the film with high expectations, and they were met. I will say that. I had really high expectations because honestly, I was impressed with the trailer. I was impressed with the production value. I had heard really good things, that it followed the book pretty exactly. And it, again, as someone who read the book, I can say, like, it really stayed true to the novel, which I can appreciate. And I think a lot of people who read the book can appreciate. It was funny. There's some moments, which I'm sure we'll talk about, where it was very evident in the theater, the groups of women in the theater I was in, that they read the book or they didn't. Like, there were certain areas of the theater where there was gasps or reactions where the rest of us weren't, because we knew what was coming. So I had very high expectations, and they were met. And I say that to not, you know, it's this weird thing where you're like, oh, I really love this music or this movie about, again, I don't think it's just about domestic violence, right? It's about friendship. It's about women, like being brave and independent and empowering. And it's about rekindled relationships. I think it's about a lot of things other than domestic violence, right? And I'm, you know, maybe I'm stretching there, but I really do. Like, I think it's about, this is not just, yes, is it the main theme? 100%. It's the main theme. But there's a lot of other things going on in this film, right? So it met my expectations, definitely. And I had very high expectations.
I do want to say, just quickly to your earlier point, you know, I have also been very blessed in my life not to directly experience any domestic violence situations. But as you mentioned, I have had many, many women in my life who have, like, a shocking number of women. And I think if you're a man listening to this, thank you so much. But I think anyone in their life, if they were to ask the women in their life, would also be shocked by the number of women who would be able to watch this movie and go, oh, I've been in situations like that where my recollection and his recollection don't match, or things were hazy, even if it wasn't directly. I mean, that, and I think the movie does a really good job of that too, of like, maybe the violence doesn't look the way that you think it's going to look.
Right.
And I also do agree with you, Erica. I think it's important to say, like, there is I don't want to say that this is that, you know, that's the only thing the film is about, because to your point, I think it does do a really good job of, like, how, you know, its other themes its other themes are explicit as well, I think. And I think that it's like a very well-rounded film.
Yeah. And, you know, like you said, I think that's a really good point too, is like, you might not be able to directly relate to, like, Blake Lively's character Lily, but, you know, again, I could relate to Jenny Slate's character, like the sister, because that's her, you know, Ryle Blake's, Lily's husband, Ryle, is her brother. But when she finds out about what's going on, she says to her, like, if you go back with him, I'm never speaking to you again. And I have been that friend that, you know, has found out that my friend is being abused. And the moment I found out, it was a very serious moment, very emotional moment. It was like, if you don't do something about this, I will. Like, I was like ready to go to the authorities, right? Like, and because, you know, if you're not someone who grew up around domestic violence or have ever experienced it yourself, it being part of your life in a different way like that is kind of jarring in a way that you're like, what do I do in this moment? How do I be supportive? And I found that really relatable. So again, there's many different aspects of this. And again, I think it was handled delicately. I don't think it was careless, or whether it was marketed one way or the other. If you actually take the time to go watch the film and experience it, I think, you know, if you're open-minded and you can, like I said, like take it in the way that, you know, it's presented, I think it could be a really powerful film for a lot of people.
What I think is interesting is, as you mentioned, because domestic violence is such a complicated topic, I think people are going to have opinions either way. I think a lot of people have opinions about this movie without actually seeing the movie. I think a lot of people are doing where they're like, oh, I'm not going to like this. And then they're sticking with that without actually having seen it. Because I do think having seen it has completely changed my mind. So I think if you have criticisms having seen the film, those are completely valid. And maybe you watch it from whatever experiences have colored your view, and you do have an issue with certain things, that's completely fine. I just think I would give it a chance, and I would watch it, and I would see if you feel differently afterwards. Because I will say what I found really interesting, you know, I went to see it with my best friend, and it's a very long drive back and forth to the theater from where we live, and the whole time we just could not stop talking. It was just like, you know, even the conversation you mentioned, like the Jenny Slate conversation, she and I both have older brothers, and so we were like, what would you do if that was your brother, you know? And so there was like so many things that we were able to kind of dig through. And I think that to your point about the book as well is something that's really powerful about it, is like, whether you agree or disagree, I think just the fact that it maybe forces you to look at these things in and of itself is really powerful and beautiful, even if you don't think it's done in a way that's particularly good or bad.
Right. Okay, so let's get into it. Where do you want to start? Like,
well, I mean, I think one thing that I want to say, and a criticism, is that it romanticizes domestic violence. But I think, as I mentioned, when you like fall for somebody, the beginning of it is romantic, and I think the movie does do a good job of like making us understand why she falls for this guy, and sort of what it is about him that draws her in. And regardless of whatever happened off screen, like I do think the chemistry was there, and I feel like both Blake and Justin were incredibly impressive and like brought a lot of depth to like, you know, what we were seeing. I mean, how do you feel about the performances? And
it's funny, actually, I went with like a good group of my a good chunk of my book club group. I talk about my book club a lot. There's like 13 of us total, including me, and I think like 7 of us went. So it was a big group, and we left, and we all of us were like, we were really impressed with the acting, not in a way that like is, you know, I think it was just like, oh, like that. Like, first of all, I feel like it was perfectly cast. I really do. Like, I feel like all the characters were really well cast. Also, can we just talk really quick about how like ridiculously well cast young Lily was? Like, it was so good. She looked like that could have actually been young Blake Lively. Like,
can I just
had to
say,
like, double take sometimes?
Yes. Okay. So, and I should not admit to going on my phone in a film. I'm so sorry, film, that I did this. But I was so convinced because I know Blake in real life. She has a niece that's like similar to the age of that girl, and they're very close. So I was fully convinced. I was like, oh, she got her niece to be in the movie. So I was like Googling to be like, are they related or not? It was shocking how similar they were. Like it was
for a second, I was like, is this CGI? Like I was like, am I seeing this correctly? Like it was uncanny how well like it looked like it could have been a younger version of her. Also for a second she kind of looked like Saoirse Ronan to me, like the younger version. I don't know, it was wild. Like I just thought it was really well cast. I thought, and that was another thing one of my friends said. We left and they were like, well, if you know Blake and Justin Baldoni didn't have chemistry, like you sure couldn't tell. Like I thought they did a really good job. Like there was tension, there was, you know, romance, like you said, like, yeah. And there's those things too, right? Like where going back into the actual characters where like in the beginning, you know, when we first meet Ryle, literally the first thing we see him do is act violent. He has like an outburst of violence, but then he's super charming. And it's so easy to forget that that was the first way we met him, right? And I think that's a thing for, you know, Lily's character that, you know, it's one of those. I also thought this was edited really well, which we'll get into that. Those like flashback moments, montage moments that she plays in her head. And that was always one of the moments that popped up. And it was like, yeah, that was the first moment you met him. But then you found out it was like he had a really intense moment at work. And, you know, oh, he was upset because of this reason. And that justified him, like, you know, kicking a chair violently. But I think it also says a lot, right? How you can overlook those moments and overlook those things. And if you're being gaslit like she was, which we'll get into, it can happen, right? You can see how it happens. And then it's also like this thing, right? Where it's like you're already in, like, she's already involved, she's already committed, then they're married, and it's like, then it's this whole thing, right? So I don't know. Sorry, I went on a little tangent there. But.
No, I think everything I do. This is, you mentioned that you could tell in your theater what sections like where people didn't read the book, because there were so many moments where I was completely like shocked.
Okay.
And like first of all, and we're gonna get into full spoilers, by the way. If we haven't mentioned that, there's gonna be full spoilers here. But first of all, the fact that they get married, I was genuinely, I don't know why I didn't think that that was going to happen. And then the biggest spoiler alert of all is like when we find out she's pregnant, which I guess I should know. I mean, it says it ends with us, so it's about breaking the cycle of abuse. But the fact that she, you know, she goes to the hospital, she, you know, and she finds out she's pregnant. I was genuinely shocked. I don't know, what were the gasp moments in your like what did people react to?
The biggest gasp, I will say, was at the end when they're having, you know, okay, again, spoiler alerts here. They've had the baby, she's had the baby, and there's kind of a cue earlier before she has the baby that she might be letting Ryle kind of creep back in, right? They're like setting up the baby's crib because, again, like she has separated herself from Ryle, but she is like, as it gets closer to when she's due with the baby, you can tell that she's like letting him back into her life a little bit. So there's that moment where you're like, you know, especially if you haven't read the book and you don't know what's going to happen, you're like, okay, she's like letting him come back. Right. And, you know, they have this moment where he's helping her set up the crib and he's like feeling the baby kick and it's very emotional. And then she's having the baby. That's very emotional. And he's like bonding with the baby. The three of them are sitting there bonding as a family right after she's had, you know, given birth, right after she's had the baby. And she's like, you know, she looks really happy. He looks really happy. They're having this emotional moment with their new baby. They decide on the name for the baby, which we can go into that. And then kind of out of nowhere, and it kind of seems like it doesn't match, she says, I want a divorce. Yeah. And when I tell you, oh, you know what's funny is nobody clapped. I like, you know, I've read that in Megan's review too, that people like clapped and cheered. my theater was gagged. Like it was like like people were shocked because you don't see it coming, right? So yeah, it was funny because you could definitely tell the little pockets of the theater that were groups of women and people that had not read the book. So yeah, that was the biggest moment. But yeah, I can imagine, that when you find out she's pregnant, or I don't know if like, okay, so find out that oh, what was a good moment too was Atlas, which, can we just say Team Atlas? Like I love that character.
That's why I'm so curious to go back and read the book, because do you think that there was maybe more depth or like more about their relationship explored in the book versus what we saw in the film?
Yeah, there's a lot more in the book. And it's really like maybe that's the only criticism I have is they show their bond. And they show, because, the movie goes from current day to flashbacks of her childhood, like high school age with Atlas and their relationship. I think there's a lot more a lot more detail on that in the book. Why they have this like special bond. I wish I could remember more details off the bat, but honestly, this is one of those books that I read so long ago and I'm surprised by how much detail I can remember, but there's not much with that. You get more, I mean, you know how it is with any book, you get more like of the character's inner monologue about how they're feeling about the person, or, whatever, stuff like that. But the moment when, because Atlas, like, he knows, right? Like, so he can read what's going on and he's like not okay with it, and he is like very committed to being there for Lily, and he writes that phone number down and puts it in the back of her phone. And I had a moment and I remember this happening in the book, where when Ryle discovers the number in the back of the phone, this is after they've already gotten married, and he calls the number, realizes who it is. There was that moment where I was like, oh, I forgot about this part, like, I mean, I didn't gasp, but I was like, oh yeah. And like my best friend who was sitting next to me, she like leaned over, she's like, don't you remember that happening? I was like, yeah, but like, I'm still in the moment, like when I'm watching it. Right. So that was another moment that was like a kind of like a good twist, if you will. But yeah, I don't know, like, there's just a lot. There's a lot. Definitely the pregnant moment. And I also was having a little bit of, because I knew that happened, right? And I obviously, like you said, there's got to be two of them and like the ending of the cycle of abuse. But when I was like, because I'm always very much like keeping track of time on, like, when I'm watching a film, to like comment on the pacing, because that's something that I think is like a big part of how a film carries the story through. And I thought this was really well paced, but it was getting to a point where I was like, when are we going to find out she's pregnant? Like, they got to get this going, right? But I do think it was done really well. Of course, I thought it was perfectly timed with that 1 hour pivot where Ryle has that where he hits her first, right? Because up until that moment, again, we're about an hour into the film, it's all rainbows and sunshine, right? Like, nothing really bad has happened, and you're like, where is this going to go? And that's when, and I think too, like this, I just want to make sure I say this and I don't forget to say it. I think the magic of film here is seen because when we first see him, the first time he hits her, and when he pushes her down the stairs, the times we see it first, it looks like it really is an accident. And then when she has the realization about what has actually happened here, and she's replaying those moments in her head, we actually see the real thing happen, right? We see her really hit her. We see him actually push her down the stairs. And I think that is like such the perfect, this is why, film is the best art form, is because you're getting all the things, right? And I just think it was that part of like the shooting and editing was like so well done, because you really could see, and that's where it's different in the book, right? Where it's like, it seemed like an accident or, you know, whatever, but you're really seeing it and you're like, man, that really did look like an accident. Like he burned his hand. It looked like he, you know, flew his hand back, and it was like, no, he hit her. Like, and then like the second time with the push down the stairs, and it's like, you know, and I really love that Megan touched on this in her review too, about how like he's a doctor, so he was able to mend her wound, like physical wound, he was able to mend, and he like didn't take her to the hospital, right? Because then there would have been questions about what happened here. And you know, so I just think it's a lot, you know.
No, it's really interesting you mentioned. I mean, that's a major part of the movie, right? It's like, you know, we see the series of events the first time, and then we realize sort of what happened later. And you know, as somebody who didn't read the book, obviously I knew there were themes, but I sort of spent the first hour of the movie kind of being like, okay, knowing that there was something sinister that was happening, and it was maybe built. And as you said, there's like, we see the chair, and we sort of, there's like this current of darkness, but it isn't until we get to, you know, certain moments later on. And then when the oven moment happens, I was so like shocked and confused, because I was like, it was an accident, right? Like, how am I supposed to interpret what I'm seeing? So yeah, and then I was like conflicted, because I was like, clearly I know this man is not a good man, but in that moment, like it looked like a legitimate accident. And I think
Right.
that again so brilliantly speaks to like the how these things can go, right? Because like the first time you really can tell yourself like it was an accident, and to go to like the gaslighting and all that kind of stuff, like you're able to internalize these things, or like make yourself feel a certain way about them, or like, I don't know. I thought that aspect of it was so brilliantly done and true to life, of like how these things unfold, and the things that you can tell yourself. And I think as an outsider, like it's easy to sit there and be like, well, no, of course he did it on purpose, or of course, blah, blah, you know, but like until you're in that situation and you love someone, like you're going to convince yourself that, you know, it was an accident. Like, oh, of course I just tripped and fell. Yeah.
Right. And did you even notice, like, because when they go to the restaurant after he's hit her and she has like the injury to her eye area, and they walk in, you can tell the concern on Jenny Slate's face. Gosh, what's her character name? I just left the theater. Come on. What's her name?
I'll look it up. And
okay, thanks. Sorry, I'm having a blank moment. You can see the concern on her face, and obviously,
Alyssa?
like, you know, Alyssa, yes. Thank you. You can see the concern on Alyssa's face, and like the whole like something's not right here moment. But then Lily and Ryle playing it off, and also the whole aspect of like, well, he also cut his hand, and like it was a whole big mess. It wasn't just the one moment, right? It was like, oh my God, he burned his hand, and then we broke the glass and he injured his hand, and oh my God. And you know, that whole aspect of it. But somebody like Atlas immediately putting two and two together, seeing his injured hand and seeing her face, like, and that's like, she can't face him, which is why she didn't want to go to back to his restaurant, right? Because he knows, and he like knows her really well, right? And I think that is something that is definitely more intimately done in the book, because there's so much more history in the book with like her parents and him like knowing about what happened, like, you know, in her childhood with her, you know, parents, and the domestic violence and domestic abuse. So that I think they still did a good job with it in the film, but if I remember correctly, there's like way more detail in the book. But him seeing, you know, and realizing immediately what's happening, I thought was really interesting, because you could tell Jenny Slate like didn't know what was going on, but Atlas like knew immediately, right? So yeah, it's heavy. It's heavy stuff.
I think you know. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No,
I was gonna say
you can see how it like like you said, like very easily in the beginning, it can be explained. It's like, oh, well, this happened and you know, he got injured too, type of thing. So anyways, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's why I thought the sort of reveal at towards the end where she kind of realizes like, oh no, all these things I thought were one way were actually another, was also just really well edited and well put together, in a way that felt true to me.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Like, it's all justifiable, right? Like, and then, oh my God, the moment that I was most disgusted by was when, you know, the second time it happens, when he pushes her down the stairs and then, you know, she's unconscious and she's waking up and she's realizing that she's injured and he's like taking care of her and he like has her repeat these things like back to him. Like that was, I was so disgusted with that because it's like textbook gaslighting, and it was just like I just, in that moment I was like, oh no, like she's in a bad place, you know. And again, obviously I know the story, I know what's going to happen, but I can see if you're someone who doesn't know the story and you're watching it, you're like, that's the moment where you're like, oh no. And
let me ask you, does the way that it unfolds in the movie, where sort of there's the article and Atlas's piece in the article and sort of Ryle pieces together the tattoo and sort of more about their past, and then there's like the sort of the final moment of abuse, like does that play out? I ask because like the way that it plays out in the film was, I mean, I was truly disturbed by it, even more so than I was expecting to be disturbed by it. And like the amount of dread and just like disgust and the way that it builds, where it's all like he comes home and there's like the friendly kiss, and then it like it just becomes more and more abusive and more disgusting. I feel like I'm not articulating the level of just like how horrified I was. So I wonder, like, how did you feel about that? I don't want to call it the climax of the film, but it's sort of where the relationship just fully deteriorates from there. So I just thought that that moment was really well done.
It's definitely the breaking point for sure, right? Yes, I will echo your thoughts and say that was the most disturbing moment in the whole film for me. Like you said, the dread, the concern in her voice when Lily's character is continuously, desperately asking him to stop, and he's not, and it's just escalating and escalating and escalating. You're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Because, you know, I don't want to say all of us women have been in this spot, because again, I have not been in that spot, but I've been in a moment in my life where I didn't necessarily want to be in that moment, and I have said stop. Luckily, I was listened to, but those moments happen and they're really scary. And here you are, you know, you're with your husband, this person that you love and trust, and you're at home because you live together, and the scary moment of her maybe thinking that she can't get away or get out of this situation, I think also really shines light on like what domestic abuse really is like and like the conversation she has with her mom, where she's like, why did you stay? And her mom literally says like, it was just easier to stay and I loved him. And I think that is as simple as an answer as that is. I think that's the real answer more than it's not. And I think it's really sad. And I think that's also like a super heavy moment where you realize, like, at least for me, where you realize this happens way more than I think it does, right? Again, as someone who did not grow up in a home like this and has never experienced it myself, I think this is very powerful in the way for me that it's like, do I know that this is something that happens? Of course. Like, I'm not, you know, let's be real. Like, I know the world that we live in, but also it's one of those things where it's like, you don't realize how much it's happening or who it's happening to or how often it's happening. But back to what you were saying, as I can't tell if I'm just now thinking of it because I just saw it in the movie, but as far as I know, that is how it plays out in the book. So basically there's like a top 10, I don't know, whatever, and like new businesses or something in Boston in a magazine. and Lily made the list, right? Her flower shop, her new flower shop that she's opened made the list. And it's very exciting. It's a very, big accomplishment. And also on the list is Atlas and his new restaurant, or, his restaurant that he's opened. And like you were saying, Ryle comes home and, Lily has made this dinner for him. It's like a celebratory moment, you think. And then that just like conniving, controlling, manipulative way that this unfolds between them, where he knows exactly what he's doing to her, that's disturbing too, because I don't really feel like we've seen him like that at all. That was like a really dark moment for me. I was like, oh, this guy is messed up, right? Like he's messed up. So what he does is he makes her read from the magazine article about the restaurant, Atlas's restaurant, and that's where it's revealed what this tattoo means, right? He puts two and two together because he realizes that, Atlas is talking about this woman from his childhood, and he realizes that that is Lily, and this whole like tattoo thing, which he's brought up to Lily before, and she's never told him what it really means. There's a lot more detail about that in the book too, if I remember correctly. About like the tattoo and all of that stuff. I do feel like they still did a good job with it, but there's definitely a lot more detail in the book about that. I kind of wish I would have reread the book right before going to see it. I just didn't have time. One of my girlfriends she like read it last week. She was like, yeah, I read it. I like reread it in 2 days or whatever. There are some details that were left out, but not enough that it affected the plot or the film or anything. I will say the only like big thing I think that if you read it, you're going to be like, oh, wow, that wasn't in the movie, was the time when, Lily finds out she's pregnant, and then there's that time where they're separated. Ryle actually goes to London for a while and is in London for a while, like just getting that separation. And they don't go into that in the movie, but I don't think it changed like the story, or there's no other like major plot points that happen because of that. So that would probably be the only thing I would say you're going to be like, what? This didn't happen in the movie, but again, I don't think it doesn't change anything really with the full story.
We can get back to the relationship. There's a couple of other aspects of the movie that I just wanted to touch on. I do think the strongest aspect of the movie is absolutely the relationship, one that she has with Atlas, because again, there's insane chemistry as well there too. And even though, we see them as teenagers and we see them more as teenagers than we do as adults, I still think the movie does a really good job of establishing this like safety with Atlas, and you do understand why she is drawn to him as a teenager and as an adult. So I think when we don't see her in these relationships, the movie is not as strong, which I think is, how do I feel about that? I don't know. I think that's a very valid criticism of the film. I think everything else that happens is a little bit like maybe too neat and tidy. But I mean, I thought it was sweet, right? That her name is Lily Blossom Bloom. She has this dream of opening a flower shop, and she opens her shop. Now, again, is it too convenient? And like, would it be realistic for a flower shop like that to survive in Boston? Who knows? Or the fact that, some rich lady walks in and says they become best friends. She meets her. Does that stuff happen in real life? Probably not. But I thought it was sweetly done. And I have to tell you, as somebody who, this part made me laugh. Fun fact about me, I love handbags. That's my thing. So the fact that first meet Jenny Slate and she walks in with like her Birkin just made me laugh, because I was like, I love how obvious this wants to be about. Like, this woman is rich. Yeah. And she's coming into this like quirky. Yeah.
I love that moment too. I'm so glad you said that. I'm also such a bag lady, like totally a bag lady. We need to talk about that more later, you and I off screen. But I'm such a bag lady too. And then Jenny Slate has so many good funny moments where she was like, we need to wipe off a surface so I can sit this down, and it's like, They do definitely go into more detail about that too in the book, where it's like, you know, clearly she's this like filthy rich woman. She just wants, and Ryle has that moment where he says it, where he discusses, like, you know, it's that one liner that gets it in there, like, oh, you're the woman my sister's working for because she's bored, or whatever it is, right? That he says, like, you know, they get that point across that, like, yeah, she's just desperate and looking for, you know, something to waste her time because she has so much time and she's rich. But yeah, I know. I think this is always interesting to me when there's books that are made into films that have these little quirky book things, right? Like, we can totally accept it in the escapism of a book where it's like, oh yeah, her name is Lily Blossom Blooms and blah, blah, blah. You know, it's like very silly, but in the book, it's like something that can be like so quickly overlooked, especially if you are someone who reads like these type of, like, not to say these types of books, but like, there's certainly things that I know you can relate to that happen in especially like romancy type of books where it's like, okay, that's a little outlandish, or like, okay, that's a little unrealistic, or, you know, like you said, there are those really tidy moments. And I've even seen people talking about the tidiness of the ending, right? For me, I definitely see the point. I liked that it was, because I think the moment that she does it and asks for the divorce, right, is, you know, I think she catches him in the perfect moment. I think it's this gotcha moment for her when he's having this really emotional, like, meeting of his child, meeting of his baby girl. And I love what Megan said in her review too, where it's like, you know, men that can only relate to these things with women when they have daughters, which is just like such bullshit. Don't even get me started on this. But I loved that gotcha moment for Lily where she's like, she knows she has him in that moment. This is her only time to make this call, and she does it. And I thought that was perfect, because I actually thought that it was so well done when she realizes that she's having a girl in that ultrasound moment. To me, that's the moment she makes the decision that she's leaving, but she doesn't even know it yet. Do you know what I mean? Like, we can see that she's made that decision, but when she actually does it, I think is the perfect. And I think that's where you have to think of it too, as in like a storytelling aspect, a film aspect, a book aspect, instead of a real life aspect, right? Like, would this have gone down as smoothly in real life? Absolutely not. Like, no, it would not have gone that way in real life. Of course it wouldn't have. I think it's the point that the film and the story and the narrative is trying to make, where it's like, she caught him in this moment where he can't give another answer other than he would beg his daughter to leave her abuser, right? She knows she has him in that moment. And yes, is that really on the nose? Yeah, but there's other, and this is where, like, it's so interesting that a film about women and like, you know, just this narrative is getting so much criticism, because there's so many other films that are really on the nose too, right? And have these moments, but they're not being discussed and is criticized as closely. So I just think that's interesting too.
And that's the thing that I kind of want to get across is, like, yeah, I mean, we could talk about the fact that it is, and pick that aspect of the film apart if we wanted to, you know, but I think, again, where it needs to be effective, it is effective. And that's what I walked away from the film feeling and thinking about and discussing and continuously discussing. So, like, yeah, I'm going to ignore the fact that she magically had the Birkin, or like the outfits, you know, were wild, truly wild. The costume design, which apparently Blake brought in a lot of her own clothes, and that was part of the drama, but she was very actively involved in the costume design. But whatever, that's not the point of the movie, you know? Like, I can sit there and say, oh, look, that's not the point. And I feel like
I agree.
If you want
to, I agree, and I don't think it took me out of the film. Some of my girlfriends had like some comments on the wardrobe, which sure, it stuck out to them, and I get why, but for me, it doesn't change. I also am like, she's a florist and she's quirky and she's really artsy and really, like, you know, I do think it plays to her character. But it's, again, not something that I think changes the narrative or changes, you know, any aspect of the film. Now, wardrobe can be used a lot in storytelling. I don't think it was, I don't think it's as big of a criticism here as it needs to be.
And actually, Erica, you bring up a really brilliant point, which is like there's so many action movies that we watch that are ridiculous and campy, and we're just supposed to say okay and enjoy it. But here we are picking apart, aspects of this film. So you just broke my brain a little bit there.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I think, it's just easier for society to criticize something that's centered around a woman or a woman's story. And I think that's why this film is getting so much slack that it's getting. But I enjoyed it. I think it's a film that people should watch and be open-minded when you're watching it. I think you should read the book. And definitely read the second book too. I mean, she really only wrote that second book because she was getting so much response from this first book with her fans, and they wanted the rest of Lily's story, right? It does tie up at the end with a nice little bow. What did you think about the ending?
I mean, that's interesting because I didn't feel that way, and I feel like you bring up the point about when she's pregnant and he comes over and he's helping her with the crib. Like I also feel like that's true to life because I've had friends who have found out they're pregnant, and they're not with their partner, that person anymore, and you still have to figure out a way to if that person's going to be in their child's life or not. What is that going to look like? So as much as I was watching that scene with like the dread of, oh, is she gonna take him back? Like I understood why she was like, hey, help me with this crib. Like I felt like that. And yes, like she does see Atlas at the end and they have a moment, but I felt like it was still very much communicating. Like she had prioritized her daughter and like her mom, she was a mom first and foremost, and this person kind of walks back into her life. So I think that like I'm okay with it. I felt like it was accurate to what it would look like for a person that was like rebuilding their life and had clearly sort of was trying to start a new chapter and had done that with their daughter.
Yeah. Do you want me to tell you anything about It Starts With Us, or do you want me to just save it?
I mean, if you think it's for our listeners, but I am gonna read both books. I will say it's gonna happen.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so yes, and I think I viewed this film as a nice, pretty tied up bow at the end because I know what happens in the sequel of the book. Like I know what happens in It Starts With Us. I will say, and I think I can say this without spoiling anything, that I will say that Lily does get her happy ending. And I think the second book does a really good job of showing how someone can move on with their life and co-parent with someone that they're not still in a relationship with, and how you can still really make sure that your child's, parent is very much a part of their life, even though you're not with that person anymore. I think the second book does a really good job at that. And I think that was why it was so important to show that she like kind of lets Ryle back into her life a little bit. And that's because it was really important to her that their child has a relationship with like her father, and that, he has a relationship with his daughter. Like, I don't really feel like that was really like explicitly said, but I think if you know what happens in the next book and like the story as a whole, you realize that the reason why she started kind of letting him back in was because she knew it was important, because this is also his child, because, they have that like intimate moment when he's feeling the baby kick, when they're putting the crib together and stuff, where you think, oh no, she's letting him back in. And she does that moment where she like puts her arms up, like puts her hands up and like kind of pushes him away. That is very telling, because she's like, I'm not doing this again. Right. Like, I'll let you feel the baby kick because this is both of us. This right here, which people, audio only can't see that I'm doing like between the two of them, right? She's acknowledging like this ain't happening, right? But she realizes how important it is for this child to have its father. So,
and you did touch on this briefly. I kind of want to go back. I do think so. Justin Baldoni, I think this is his third feature. I know he's also directed some television, but the films that he has done in the past have been like YA, kind of more for teens. But having seen both of them, and I got to interview him, I've always been really impressed with him as a filmmaker, because I actually think he brings a lot of depth to what he's doing, even when he was like directing. I think he did that film 5 Feet Apart that came out a couple years ago. I don't know. I've always found him to be an interesting filmmaker, and I think what he does with It Ends With Us is interesting. There's a lot of moments that feel elevated to me, where I feel like maybe another filmmaker could have said, this is just maybe a fluffier moment. And so I don't have to put thought into it. And it felt like it was a very thoughtful, purposeful film. And I do commend that. And I mean, it's clear again, watching his interviews, that he did feel like very connected to the material and has a lot of respect for it. And just as you mentioned, like, I think the editing is really well done, and the score, and sort of even like there's moments where, as I meant, there's like a My Tears Ricochet, by the way, one of my favorite Taylor Swift songs. But there's also moments where like there is no music, and it is like kind of forcing you to deal with like what's happening on screen, and it's very purposeful about what we hear and what we don't hear, which I think is very well done as well. So it's like a very well crafted film. And Christy Hall, who by the way made her directorial debut earlier this year with Daddy-O, a film that I really like and encourage people to watch. I think that it does a good job with the screenplay, given, as you mentioned, like there's so much that happens in the book, and it's dealing with multiple timelines. Would I have liked to see more of the teenage stuff? Yeah, but I think it does really well with like, we're given enough, I think. And again, I think a lesser screenwriter would have not been able to balance the threads as well as she did, where we're able to understand these bonds. And we're able to understand sort of how Lily's parents have shaped her, and how that shapes the experience that she has with Ryle. So yeah, I think I do think it's a well-crafted film, and I think it deserves credit there that it hasn't been given necessarily.
I echo that completely. I think you said it perfectly. And I was sitting there in certain moments in the film thinking, oh, what would I be thinking right now if I didn't know this story? And I think there was a really good job. Like I mentioned earlier, I do think there was a lot of tension and a lot of buildup. And even as someone who did know what was going to happen in the story, I still felt that, which I think is really important. But I did think, man, this would be way more intense if I didn't know what was going to happen here. So there is something satisfying about knowing what's going to happen. But I was trying to like have this moment where I was like, what would I be thinking right now if I didn't know what was going to happen in this, But yeah, I thought I honestly, like I said, production value, like chef's kiss. I thought all aspects of it were really well done. Pacing was great. Casting was great. Editing, storytelling. Like I really, like, I was really, really impressed. And it definitely met my expectations, and I was not disappointed leaving the theater at all. And none of my girlfriends too. Like, I think all of us read the book, and everyone left and thought had the same thoughts, which, is always like a good, satisfying moment too. So
yeah, I think my theater similarly was very happy, and I feel like people who maybe hadn't read the book kind of had the same mentality that I did, of like, this wasn't what I was expecting in a positive way.
yeah.
So are there any aspects of the film that we haven't touched on that we should talk about as we wrap?
I don't think so. It's interesting because, again, I'm going to bring up the outside the film drama again, but this was something that, like, I've seen some people talking about with the whole domestic violence aspect, that, like, it's kind of shocking that at the end of the film, there's no like domestic hotline or, something like that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or, if you felt like it should have been there. Like, what do you think?
I mean, yeah, I've seen other films where it has been. Yeah. I'm not ready to dismiss the film as a whole just because it's not there, though. I think a lot of what is happening with the discourse around this film is what is happening with our discourse in general, where something has to be completely good or completely bad, right? Like, Blake is either this perfect goddess, fashionista actress amazing, or she's terrible and we need to tear her down and get rid of her, right? Or like Justin is either the hero that's discussing all these dark themes, or he's this director that was horrible to his cast and they want nothing to do with him. And I think we need to realize that like these narratives are too far apart and the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, and that's okay. And maybe
100%.
everyone involved has made mistakes. And maybe there are aspects of this film that, as we've discussed, could have been better, not as fluffy, whatever. But I'm not willing to throw a film that does a very beautiful job with a lot of other things away just because there is no hotline or the fashion's a little crazy or whatever else you want to throw at it.
That was perfect the way you said that. That was perfect. I could not agree more. Like 100% agree with literally everything you just said. So, I will say.
Erica, oh, go ahead. Well, I was going to ask you because one of the criticisms that I have heard about the film is that it's a little bit too maybe like compassionate towards Ryle. And I haven't brought it up until now because I don't know how to feel about it, because I guess my perspective is like, it's not for me to say if we're being too compassionate towards this person or not. And the reality is like a lot of people have dark things that happen to them and they end up becoming abusers. And again, we have to reconcile the fact that this person was traumatized and maybe feel compassion for their trauma, and also say that trauma has led them to harm other human beings. And like both of these things could be true. And I think the film does a good job of that, but maybe I'm not the right I don't know.
I very much I'm glad we're talking about this, because I would have been upset if we forgot to. I'm glad the film, I need to go, like when I was sitting in the theater, when that moment comes up why you learn what has happened to Ryle and his trauma and his past. It's interesting because in my head, and I need to go back and look in the book or look it up, and that in the book, if I remember correctly, and I could be completely wrong here, this is how I'm remembering it, is that was his trauma was way more based on why he was the way he was, with this whole like, I don't open up to people and I don't do relationships and I don't do any of that type of thing. That was like really what his trauma was like. It kind of felt like with this, it was kind of like an explanation for his violence. And if I'm remembering correctly, I don't remember it really being like that in the film or in the book. I remember it being more like this was why he was so guarded and so like he doesn't do the whole relationship thing, and he was really like distant in that aspect. It was like, oh, he doesn't do this, he doesn't get close to people, So that's something that I need to revisit. Again, there's so many things, with any book, right? Like, and movie adaptation, there's way more detail in the book, right? There's way more detail with, like you said earlier, if you want that, more detail about the teenager aspect in that story with Atlas and Lily, you get way more of that in the book. And then that aspect was the only other one that I was like, man, I'm remembering this differently from the book. Like that seemed more like she definitely, if I remember correctly, she knew about Emerson before they got married too. I don't know. That was the only thing that I'm like, I'm not remembering this correctly, or they've switched it up a little bit in the movie. So I need to go look that up. But again, for spoilers and people who, have seen the film, basically we find out that Ryle, accidentally shot his older brother when he was 6 years old and killed him. Which is also like an interesting aspect too about like gun safety. Like, that's something, because it's also like you realize in the very beginning of the film when Ryle has his outburst, when he and Lily meet, when he has this outburst where he kicks a chair because he's really upset, it's because he tried to save a young boy who was accidentally shot by his brother, and he's a neurosurgeon, and he tried to save this young boy who was shot and couldn't do anything about it. And obviously this is making him relive his trauma in a very, very personal way. And he even says in that, because like he's telling Lily about it, and he even says to Lily, or Lily says like, oh my God, like I can't imagine that child that survived, like what they're going through. And he was like, oh, this will ruin the rest of their life. And you know, there's that foreshadowing where you realize later when you find out his story where he was the child that survived, and then you realize, oh, this is why you're like, okay, you had really bad trauma and you're really messed up from it, you know? But again, not an excuse for domestic abuse. I don't know. It's again, this is complicated. It's heavy. There's a lot going on here.
And I will say, to me, I don't think the film is trying to say that trauma is justifying what he's doing. If you've seen the film and you want to make that argument, I would be open to that, because there is a reading of the film that would lend itself to that, I think. So if you feel that way, I respect that. I think it's really interesting that when Alyssa, Jenny Slade's character, is revealing these things to Lily, like she kind of has this moment where she says like, I was there too, I remember it, but it affected Ryle a lot differently than it did to me. Right. Which I thought was really interesting, because it's like somebody can be your sibling, you can grow up in the same house in the same circumstances necessarily, but maybe the way that you handle something is completely different. I thought that was like an interesting little layer. Yeah. And as you mentioned, like the gun violence. So, you know, I haven't maybe necessarily fully composed my thoughts on that aspect of the film, but I thought it was interesting.
I'll be interested to see what you think when you read the book, because again, there's just so much more detail in these things. In all reality, I'm impressed that they were able to keep this film at 2 hours and 10 minutes with all of the detail in it. Because I didn't realize it was 2 hours and 10 minutes when I went into it, but they did cover a lot of the book, and it could have very easily been 2.5 hours. I'm glad that they didn't push it to that. But it definitely could have been. So
I think that's a good place for us to wrap. How are you feeling, Erica?
I feel very, like, you know, satisfied with my experience with the film. I feel like I maybe want to reread the book. I'm excited to hear what you think of the book. I'm excited to like go and read some more reviews of what people think of it. I hope I'm excited, because I also feel like it could be one of those things where I'm like, why did I start reading these things? And maybe people are saying really terrible things, but I hope, you know, this is a very, you know, meaningful story to a lot of people. Again, like, I think we need to remember that this is Colleen Hoover's, you know, personal experience. Unfortunately, this is something that a lot of people deal with. So I hope this is some type of like cathartic experience for a lot of people, a lot of women especially. And yeah, I thought it was, like you and I have both discussed, like really well done film. And, you know, again, to celebrate a film that's about domestic violence, I think we need to just spin it and look at it as like, this is an accomplishment in storytelling. And, yeah. What about you? What do you think?
You know, and this was something I forgot to touch on earlier, but I think it's really interesting. As I mentioned, you know, I was having so many discussions after seeing the film, and one of the things that my friend and I talked about is how much more like our generation of women know about domestic violence and understand about domestic violence. Because like, if you look at Lily's mom's generation, the mentality was like, he's my husband, and like maybe certain things are okay, you know, whereas like now we understand so much more about consent and relationships and what is acceptable, what is not. The fact that you and I are even having this conversation,
right?
There's a world 10, 15, 20 years ago where you and I having this conversation would not even be a thing. So right. I just think that's really interesting on its own. And if this film, you know, leads to more conversations between friends, leads to more people getting help, getting out, or just having an awareness of like, this is going, as you mentioned, like this is going on in the world. I think that's really important and really beautiful and necessary. So yeah, I'm happy to live in a world where we can have stories like this, even if it's like messy and imperfect, and open to, be open to criticism about it too.
Absolutely. I think you made a really good point there. Like you said, like, if nothing else, this is a conversation starter, hopefully, for a lot of people that maybe have not been able to tell their stories.
And again, as we mentioned, Megan's piece is really important, so please make sure to read that. If hopefully maybe this will also inspire you to read other stories if you're open to it. If this is a subject matter that's difficult, obviously that's completely understandable. Thank you so much for listening to us have this conversation. It was a very difficult conversation, very delicate at times. And Erica, thank you so much for being open to talk about these things with me. It's not easy, so I'm glad that we were able to do this and we have an avenue to do it. As always, very grateful to the team at In Session and JD and everybody. So
yeah, definitely feel really grateful to have a platform where we can discuss films like this openly without judgment, and nobody's perfect, so hopefully the things we've said today is something that people can hear and feel okay with hearing, but also feel like we did it justice. So appreciate everyone listening. Again, like you said, appreciate the In Session team, appreciate JD. And again, just having this platform to discuss the fun films and the exciting films, but also to discuss these ones that are a little heavier and have more weight to them. So, yeah.
And I think, as we mentioned before, like, this is our take on the film based on our experiences. And if you have a completely different take based on your experiences, that's valid. And I think to be able to engage with all of it is really important for film criticism and just in society in general. So we will wrap this episode and this podcast review of It Ends With Us. Thank you so much. As always, please follow In Session Film. You can see us back on our regular home, Chasing the Gold, all throughout award season. But I'm Shadan Larkey, and that's a wrap. And she's Erica Richards at E-Rock Reviews. If you live in a world where you don't follow Erica, why? You should follow Erica. You should follow me. You should follow In Session.
Yes, and thank you for listening. Yeah, and go see us over at Chasing the Gold when we're there. So yeah, a lot to look forward to there.
We'll catch you on the next one, guys. Thank you so much.